YouTube channel Neri the Coder. Today I came up with a brand new CSS3 course for you guys. In this course we're going to be covering a lot of things, so make sure that you follow along. Let's just go through the course outline and see what we'll be covering. The first thing we'll be covering is basically the CSS3. We'll be talking about CSS3. We'll be talking about BIM. We'll talk about less, SAS, SCSS and stylus. We'll cover Tailwind CSS as well. We'll cover Bootstrap. We'll cover styled components in JSS. We'll cover material UI, semantic UI, chakra UI. So what is basically CSS3? CSS3 is basically a style sheet language used for describing the presentation of a document written in markup language such as HTML. So if you are already familiar with HTML, then you might have come up with, or you might already know CSS, and you might already know how to use it. But if you're not familiar with CSS3, then don't worry, but at least you would have knowledge of HTML. So I would expect that you know the basic tags of HTML. If not, then we'll go through that as well. We'll be covering some CSS properties like margins, paddings, backgrounds, colors, text, fonts, lists, and tables, then positioning and pseudo clauses, forms, layouts like grid and flex. Transformations, we'll cover some animations as well, and the responsive designing with media queries and the CSS properties. We'll also cover some CSS selectors. So a CSS selector is basically how do we select or apply styles to different HTML elements. So, and then we'll be covering some CSS functions, the built-in function of CSS, and then some CSS units. Then we'll cover some CSS default values and how you can override them. And also we'll talk about block element modifier, BEM. That is basically a component-based approach to web development. The idea behind it is to divide the user interface into independent blocks and basically name them. And this makes interface development easy and fast, even with the UI, with the complex UI, and it allows to reuse the existing code without copying and pasting. And then the most important part of this course will be to talk about preprocessors and how it works. So most of the time, people are using preprocessors and the real world projects. So we'll be talking about less, we'll be talking about SAS and CSS and SCSS and stylus. And a CSS preprocessor is a program that lets you generate CSS from the preprocessor's own unique syntax, which adds some features that don't exist in pure CSS. So it's basically built on top of CSS, and it gives you some more functionality, some extra functionality that you can reuse your CSS code, and you don't have to write the properties time by time, and that's not being part of the CSS itself. So we'll be covering variables, magazines, and nesting operations, escaping functions, namespaces, and accessors, map scopes, comments, and importing, and the preprocessor lectures. We'll be talking about Tailwind CSS. It's basically a utility-first CSS framework packed with classes like flex, padding top, and then the text center and rotate. That can be composed to build any design directly in your markup. So basically, Tailwind CSS is based on CSS, and you don't have to write explicit CSS styles or properties. All you have to do is just to import the Tailwind CSS files, and then start using it by just importing the files or specifying the CSS names, the class names in your elements. We'll be talking about Bootstrap as well. So Bootstrap is the most popular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript framework for building responsive mobile-first projects on the web. So the difference between Tailwind CSS and Bootstrap is that Tailwind is basically a utility-first CSS framework, and Bootstrap is basically built upon HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that's a little bit difference. Then we'll be talking about styled components and JSS. Styled components lets you write actual CSS in your JavaScript. And JSS is an authoring tool for CSS, which allows you to use JavaScript to describe styles in a declarative and conflict-free and reusable way. So both of them are basically using the front-end frameworks of JavaScript like React. So the style components are basically you create a component and then apply styles to that specific component. Where on the other hand, JSS is basically it's also called CSS in JavaScript, which allows you to write your styles in JavaScript, and then you can apply those styles to other components. You'll also be talking about material, chakra, and semantic UIs. So it basically all of them provides handful of UI layout tools, and they're basically famous for pre-styled UI components which can be customized or reskinned. And nowadays, like in the real world applications, people mostly use these libraries, and they just take the components and reskin them or redesign them or customize them. They use it for their own purpose. The difference between all of these three is basically the ease of usability and customizability. So it depends on how easy it is for you to use one or other. But personally, I've used Material UI a lot of the time, and I personally prefer Material UI. It is a lot of documentation and a big community. So yeah, we'll go through all of them one by one, and we'll be discussing them in the real world projects, and we'll create some projects. So yeah, that's basically the end of the outline for this course. And I hope that you will learn something new and something useful from this course. And until then, I'll see you. Bye.